Well, firstly, hi to everyone online. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today, discussing and presenting disaster recovery and best practices for those plans. Obviously, we're also looking at the approaching summer season and discussing some of the risks that might present to your organisations. We've had a great reception in terms of organisations wanting to know more about disaster recovery and how you might adopt that for your plans, and in particular looking to learn more around the approaching summer season and some of the risks that might present to your ICT infrastructure and indeed your disaster recovery strategies. In saying that, my name is Glenn Flower. I'm the Head of Marketing here at Nextgen Group, and look forward to hearing from our two presenters today who I'm going to introduce. Firstly, Agatar Amalska from the Bureau of Meteorology. Agatar is a senior climatologist and will be discussing the approaching summer season for us, looking at some of the risks that may present to your disaster recovery planning. I'd also like to introduce Mark Dugan. Mark is the Managing Director of Frost & Sullivan for Australia and New Zealand, and Mark will be discussing best practice for disaster recovery planning and also looking at some of the research Frost & Sullivan have conducted in terms of the impacts of particularly natural disasters on businesses. The agenda for this afternoon is fairly simple. We'll be having two parts to the webinar. The first is very much around, as I noted, Agatar talking through the summer season and in particular touching on El Nino, which is really presenting itself as a significant impact across Australia over the summer period. And then part two will be Mark going through DR best practice and also, as I noted, some of the research. In between those two presentations, we'll be running a poll. You'll see the question presented to you on the web, and we look forward to everyone completing your thoughts as to the maturity of your DR plan with that poll. There'll be a poll at the middle of the presentation, but also at the end. We'll ask questions at the completion of the two presentations. Questions can be presented to the two presenters via the web page that you'll see on the webinar, and we'll endeavour to ensure that we get all of the questions covered through the two industry experts in terms of the webinar. So, without further ado, I look forward to handing over to Agatar Amalska from Bureau of Meteorology.
Thank you very much. So I'm Agatar Amalska, Senior Climatologist at the Bureau of Meteorology, and I will be talking to you about the spring and summer outlook. So in particular, I will be covering a few points on Australia's climate, specific mention of the El Nino that we're experiencing this year. I'll then go through some of the climate outlooks for the rest of spring and also summer, and also show a few tools and services from the Bureau of Meteorology that is worth keeping track of, particularly if you want to keep abreast of some of the developments with some of the climate drivers there. So starting off with Australia's climate, we really are the land of droughts and flooding rain. So Australia has got one of the most variable climates in the world, and it's one example I wanted to show you is just characterized in some of the big swings in rainfall in particular. So here I have two rainfall decile maps, so showing two different periods. On the left there, we've got 2002-2003 period during an El Nino, which resulted in widespread, very dry conditions. So the darkest reds, they're showing areas of Australia that had their lowest rainfall on record for that period. The darker, second darkest areas there are in the lowest 10%, so very significant dry conditions. But not even a decade later, we had a complete shift with the Millennium Drought breaking with two very strong La Nina events, which resulted in some record rainfall for the period. Again, most of Australia in the top 10% of wettest periods there on record. So seeing these sort of continental scale shifts in our rainfall regime is really very unique to Australia, and it's one of the reasons why we have such a variable climate. Now, I wanted to sort of touch on what are the reasons behind us having such a variable climate. And here we can see some of the main climate influences that really contribute to the weather patterns that we get on any given day for Australia. Being a land girt by sea, the ocean plays a really key role in terms of the weather systems and climate influences we experience. But one of the really key drivers, the biggest climate influence we've got is the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, which is the main driver of those really big swings. But it certainly isn't the only one, and we'll have a look at how some of these other climate drivers can really either work with or negate some of the influence there. So ENSO is quite a complex driver. It is a climate phenomenon which consists of changes in tropical Pacific Ocean temperatures, but also the atmosphere. So a number of quite complicated indicators and also modelling that goes into forecasting where we're at. But I just thought I wanted to give you a bit of a snapshot of the really key information around impacts and decision making when it comes to looking at ENSO. So here I have the ENSO tracker, Bureau of Meteorology's tool for tracking ENSO dial there, which shows really the three key phases of ENSO. El Nino, the phase which we are in right now, La Nina, which is the opposite, the wet influence, and neutral. Neutral is really the phase that we sort of refer to as the normal conditions, and that's because we're in that state 50% of the time. The remainder we are either in El Nino and La Nina, and those are the phases that really give us some of those strong impacts there. So just looking at the impacts associated with La Nina and El Nino, of course. In La Ninas, on the left here, I have the image, again, looking at rainfall deciles across Australia during the two strong back-to-back La Nina events of 2010 and 12. And on the right, we can see the typical winter-spring La Nina pattern for rainfall. So this is looking at La Nina events in our historical record and the impact it has had on rainfall. And you can really see that over most of Australia, we get above average rainfall to even very much above average. One point I wanted to note is if you look on the east coast there, particularly northern half of New South Wales, not as much influence. So the Great Dividing Range is a really key factor there with regards to separating us, not just physically, but climatologically from some of the influences. But really, we are in El Nino right now, so we're going to focus more strongly on the impacts associated with El Ninos. Here on the left, I have a similar plot for typical rainfall patterns for winter and spring. I put winter and spring because that's generally where we see the strongest impact with regards to rainfall, but certainly the effects moves into summer as well. And what you can see here is that over much of eastern Australia, El Nino generally results in drier conditions. So again, the east coast not as strong of an impact, but in general we see below average rainfall there. And one other very key thing about El Ninos is it has a very strong influence on maximum temperatures too. So on the right hand side here we can see the influence on maximum daytime temperatures during El Nino. So again, very warm days, dry conditions, really the key factors influencing that El Nino influences on our climate. One thing I really wanted to point out though, given there's been a lot of attention in the media regarding how strong this event is, and in fact it's the strongest since 1997-98, which is a very strong event, but the strength of the El Nino is not an indicator of how severe the impacts will be. Every single event is different, and a part of that is associated with what's going on with some of the other climate drivers, and so is not the only climate driver that influences rainfall and temperatures for Australia. And here just wanted to show an image of just that. So aside from the current event, our two strongest El Niños on record is 1982 and 1997, and I have two rainfall maps there, and you can see quite different impacts. 1982, very strong dry influence over Australia. 1997, most of Australia being within average, so white areas are areas that had around average rainfall during that period. So this is quite an important point. In general, they are associated though with those drier conditions. So some other statistics there. We've had 26 El Niños since 1900. 17 of them resulted in widespread drought. They generally last from 6 months to 2 years. Autumn is really when we see these events develop and establish during winter, and generally they will go through till summer, decaying through, and autumn once again we might see the redevelopment. So we're stuck with this event till the end of summer basically, now that it's established itself. So just wanted to touch on some of the other El Nino impacts that are quite important. Again, really this is the crux of why we talk about El Nino so much. And those dry and warmer conditions that we tend to see during El Ninos result in bushfires being more likely. So we're seeing some of that impact in Western Australia, but I know South Australia as well. And I'll show a bushfire outlook that really draws on some of this increased risk for us. Heat waves are more likely, and in fact during El Niños we see increased numbers of heat waves. So the warm spell we have just had at the start of October over much of eastern and southern Australia is really just the first of the warm conditions that we're likely to see this spring and summer. Tropical cyclones, landfalling as well as within the general region, are less likely for the Queensland east coast. For NT and WA, we tend to see similar numbers in terms of tropical cyclones that make landfall. Widespread flooding across eastern Australia is less likely during El Niños, again due to those dry conditions. Storms are mostly only in WA, more likely, but over the East Coast, generally we see storms in any given summer season, so really important to prepare for that, and some of the localised flooding that can be associated with that. And drought, more likely given the dry and warm influence there from El Nino. So I thought I'd touch on a bit more about what's been going on with El Nino this year. It is the strongest event since 97-98, and certainly might be up there in terms of exceeding some of those values. It's interesting to note that ENSO isn't just Australia's biggest climate driver, it is the biggest global climate driver. And the strength of this event, although the strength of the El Niños isn't an indicator of the severity of the impacts, we have seen some very severe impacts internationally. So just some headlines there about some of the other global impacts associated. But it's been quite an interesting case. So in winter, our rainfall was mixed. So there was actually parts of Eastern Australia that had some pretty good falls, and some of that mixed impact, some of those good falls were really associated with the Indian Ocean. So we had some very warm sea surface temperatures. It negated some of the dry influence. More recently though, we've seen those temperatures cool off, and the Indian Ocean has really shifted to reinforcing those dry conditions. So quite a significant a change there with what's been going on. Some of our other climate drivers really lining up to increase our odds of dry conditions and again that heat. So again, reinforcing those chances of increased risk of warm daytime temperatures, heat waves and bushfire. So just showing the ENSO tracker there again, we are in El Nino and we are going to see that persist to the end of summer. So that influence will carry through till the El Nino will decay as we generally see with these events. Now I just wanted to show a few climate outlooks for spring and summer. And previously what we've seen is a bit of a tug of war between the Indian and Pacific Ocean, so those competing influences. And we do see a little bit of that influence still hanging in there as the Indian Ocean still is a tad warmer. So here what I've got is the rainfall outlook. It's a probabilistic outlook looking at areas that are likely to see wetter or drier conditions, so showing the odds of that. And for October and December, really you can see a bit of that wet influence, but really seeing some dry conditions there for the southeast in particular. But I really wanted to point out October, there, the map in the middle, very strong odds for dry conditions across Australia, and this is really the result of the Indian and the Pacific Ocean, those influences there really reinforcing each other, and again this will reinforce increased bushfire risk, increased chances of heat waves, and those conditions. So we actually, at the Bureau of Meteorology, did a special update of our climate outlook just yesterday. So these maps, these models and outlooks are quite new, and this was very much driven by quite significant changes in the influences over our climate. So very important there, and some of you may have seen some of the media around this and the strong El Nino as well. Just showing the same again outlook for October to December for temperatures. So again you can see that for most of southern and central Australia, we're expecting warmer temperatures for both maximum and minimums. So again, reinforcing that dry pattern, clear conditions, very warm, increasing our chances of heat waves as well as warmer daytime temperatures, nighttime temperatures overall. And just wanted to touch on a couple of other relevant outlooks, and just before I go into it, I wanted to show the longer term context for 2015. Here on the left I've got the map of rainfall for the last 10 years for the cool season. And what you can see there is for much of Eastern Australia, southern parts, it's been quite dry. On the right-hand side, this map shows temperatures over the last 10 years for maximum temperatures, and you can see most of Australia there very warm, top 10% or warmest on record with those dark orange areas there. Those very warm and very dry conditions have certainly set us up for increased bushfire risk, along with the presence of the current El Nino. So here I wanted to show the bushfire potential outlook for the 2015-16 bushfire season, and we can see there those brown areas are where we have increased risk of bushfires, and it's really from the climate perspective driven by the conditions we've seen over the last 10 years, but also the El Nino and the dry and warm influence again. But there are certain things that regardless of what phase of ENSO we are in, that we generally see and expect and need to be prepared for, and severe thunderstorms are certainly up there. So those can really occur at any time of the season. There is slightly increased likelihoods for that for Western Australia, but in general really an important feature to keep in mind. And what do we mean by severe thunderstorms? those are storms that produce hail greater than 2 centimeters in diameter, damaging wind gusts of 90 kilometers. So really that threshold is where we see some significant damage, flash flooding and tornadoes, again, localized but very high impact events. So for those of you that want to keep abreast of what is going on and are particularly sensitive to these climate influences, the Bureau has a number of tools and services that to really support either your business continuity from a very short-term as well as long-term perspective. So from tomorrow to 3 months and beyond. And I just wanted to point out some of the features of where you can find some of this on our website. So I'm guessing quite a lot of you would have been to our website. On the front page there, next to the satellite image of Australia, Meta is a weather forecasting tool. It's a graphical user interface showing grids, breaks down our forecasts into three-hourly blocks. You can look at chances of some strong winds or heavy rainfall. You can really see how the conditions are evolving in that more shorter term. But also if you're looking, if you want to find out more about what's happening with ENSO or check out our monthly updates of our climate outlook, if you scroll past the weather forecasts, under our services you'll find climate and past weather. They've got highlighted there in purple. And within that page you can see we've got a tool called ENSO Wrap Up. Also the tiles there on the right hand side showing you the rainfall outlook, which shows the rainfall and temperature outlook for the next 3 months. We generally update that on the third Thursday of every month, and so we update on a fortnightly basis. We also produce monthly climate videos that really tie in all of the information, past conditions, where we are with some of our climate drivers and what to expect in the next 3 months. So very useful information there. So in summary, 2015 has been another warmer than average year, and we're expecting that to continue with the current El Nino, which is really the dominant climate driver on our weather patterns this season. The presence of El Nino changes our risks for a number of factors. So we've got an increased risk of heat waves, and particularly now that we're going into summer, really about to see the crux of that coming through. We do have a decreased risk of widespread flooding, but keeping in mind that localized risk remains the same. So again, those severe thunderstorms being one of the key elements there. We do have an increased risk of bushfire in many areas due to the dry and warm conditions, both past and also going into this season. Tropical cyclones are always possible, but on the east Queensland coast during El Niños we generally see less tropical cyclone crossings. And that is it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Agatha. That was fantastic. Obviously, we can see that there is a significant increase in what we're likely to experience this summer, particularly around temperatures, drought, and the need for increased power consumption. Like I mentioned in the introduction, we will now present a question to you. We'd love to run a poll. If everyone can quickly respond to the poll in terms of the information that you've just been presented with, that would be fantastic, and then we'll quickly move into Mark's presentation. So just to let everyone who's on the webinar know that we've got quite a significant amount of people feeling quite comfortable with the approaching weather conditions, but around 30% are quite concerned and therefore have some thoughts on how they might have to handle that through their DR plans. Okay, so thanks everyone for that. So what I'll do now is hand over to Mark Dugan, MD of Frost & Sullivan.
Thanks very much indeed, Glenn, and I'd like to add my welcome to everybody. I'm going to be talking today about the impact of disruption on businesses, disruptions that can be caused by some of the weather-related incidents that Agatha referred to earlier on, whether they're bushfires that impact a facility or perhaps bring down a power line causing a power outage, or non-meteorological events such as earthquakes or even localized building fires, flooding, or employee-related events such as deliberate sabotage or perhaps just even employee incompetence. Now, globally, the cost of these kind of disruptions is really quite astonishing. An organization called EMC does an annual data protection survey, and they estimated that in 2014 the cost of disruptions to businesses globally was about 1.7 trillion US dollars, and about 55 billion of that was in Australia. And that business cost comes from two main areas: the cost of business downtime, which is almost $1 trillion, and the cost of data loss, which is about $754 billion. Now, to put all this in a perspective, at a global level, the impact on the global economy, that $1.7 trillion, is about the same size as the total economy of Canada. And at the level of Australia, it's equivalent to about 4% of our GDP. So you could argue that these kind of business disruptions are costing Australia, typically in an average year, about 4% of GDP. And these disruptions have a number of impacts. They cause loss of employee productivity. They can cause loss of revenue because of an inability to sell products or services to customers. Client dissatisfaction can clearly be a major impact. Delays in product and service development. And globally, about half of all of these disruptions are caused either by power failure and or by a natural disaster. The other half are caused by factors such as hardware failure, employee sabotage, or cyber threats. And perhaps one very notable factor is that an organization in the US, a government agency called the National Archives and Record Administration, identified that 93% of businesses that lost their data center for more than 10 days filed for bankruptcy within 12 months of disaster. So loss of access to an in-house or an outsourced data center is almost terminal for most organizations if that loss extends beyond a fairly limited period in terms of number of days. It really is quite a critical issue, is to have ongoing access to the data and the applications that are hosted within your data center. Another interesting fact that emerged from the EMC survey was that actually when they rank countries in the Asia-Pacific region in terms of how mature they are, in terms of data protection methodologies, data protection approaches, Australia ranks actually only in the middle. Interestingly, China is ranked at the best prepared country in Asia-Pacific for data loss or business disruption. Australia is only in the middle of the pack, so it does seem that we have some way to go, on average, to prepare ourselves for these kinds of disruptions. And I think one interesting factor perhaps behind that in Australia is that the use of off-premise cloud-based services, either to store data or to access software, is actually quite a bit lower than many of us think. So although over recent years use of cloud computing has become a much more common feature of the IT environment in Australia, with many more organizations now using cloud services either for data storage or provision of business applications, a majority of businesses in Australia actually are still reliant on on-premise data storage and on on-premise application hosting. Even among larger organizations, a majority are still using on-premise solutions. And what this does, of course, it makes these organizations very vulnerable to any event that affects their premises. Because not only would they therefore lose a working location, but they would also be unable to work from any other location because they'd have lost access to the data and the business applications that are also stored on-premise. So this vulnerability largely comes from this use still of large on-premise facilities, whether they're servers on-premise, whether they're small server rooms, even whether they're on-premise data centers, where organizations store their data and access their applications from. This is a major area of vulnerability because it means if you lose access to your premises, you also lose access to your data and to your applications. So let's look at some of the what you might call an unprecedented wave of natural disasters that's hit the region and Australia in recent years. 2011, for example, we saw the tsunami in Japan, we saw very extensive flooding in Thailand and in Australia, we saw the Christchurch earthquake, we saw many other events. And in 2013, the total cost of these natural disasters globally approached 200 billion. Super Typhoon Haiyan, for example, 13 billion. Typhoon Fitao, 10 billion. Floods in China, almost 10 billion. And these costs are being driven both by an increasing frequency of events, but also by factors that significantly increase the cost per event. For example, population growth in areas affected and an increasing level of infrastructure that means that when a natural disaster occurs, its economic impact is normally much higher. Another example is Hurricane Sandy, that was dubbed, I think, Frankenstorm by the US media, which flooded businesses in downtown Manhattan and forced the New York Stock Exchange to close for the first time in 30 years. I mean, just some examples of the impact that Hurricane Sandy impacted. United Airlines lost about $90 million in flight cancellations. Pharmacy company Walgreens had to close 1,400 stores. About 1/4 of all mobile phone sites across 10 states went down. 25% of cable operators were unable to deliver their service for a period of up to 5 days. So across a wide range of businesses and industry sectors, the impact of Hurricane Sandy on the US economy was about $70 billion. Let's look a little bit closer to home. Also in 2011, we had very significant flooding that impacted Brisbane, Australia's third city, that basically took out most of the CBD. And about 20% of all businesses in Brisbane had to close their operations for an average of 8 days each. For those that were unable to access off-premise data or off-premise applications, it basically meant that they couldn't do anything really for an average of 8 days. And again, on average, it was 31 days before businesses returned to normal. The economic impact ran into billions. Many organisations found that their IT infrastructure was severely affected. Many organisations had servers on their premises, perhaps even in their basements, that were flooded. And as mentioned, they not only lost access to their premises, but lost access to applications and to data. And about 63% of businesses that were affected by the floods in Brisbane indicated that the floods would have a minor to moderate impact on the viability of their business. But 20%, that's 1 in 5, indicated that the floods had a very critical impact on their business. And about 10% ultimately went out of business as a direct result of that flooding. Just to provide an example of a non-meteorological event, shortly after the Brisbane floods, I think only about a month later, a major earthquake struck the CBD of Christchurch, New Zealand. It's the second biggest city in New Zealand. Over 200 people were killed and hundreds of buildings were either destroyed or severely damaged. And basically, for those of you who've been to Christchurch, pretty much the entire CBD has been closed off ever since, with most people unable to access CBD premises for a period now of 4 years. So as a result of the earthquake, about 18% of businesses in Christchurch had to reduce staff numbers, 40% directly lost revenue, 27% had to relocate. In some industry sectors, like for example professional services, almost 60% of businesses had to relocate. And the disruption was enormous, particularly for those that lost access to their premises. And for those that had all their data and applications hosted on site, the disruption was particularly onerous because, of course, as well as not having anywhere for their staff to work, they also had no way of accessing their IT resources. So overall, a huge number of businesses are exposed to the potential impact of any event that takes out their in-house servers where applications and data are stored. In Australia, for example, we estimate that something like 50,000 organisations of 10 or more employees are still using an in-house server room or in-house closet, server closet, to store their data applications. And despite potentially having manual backup processes in place, the potential impact on a business is enormous because manual backup, of course, can only apply to data, not giving real-time access to applications. So anything that takes out your premise, if that's where you host your applications and your data, is going to have a very significant impact on your business. So we wanted to understand the impact that natural disasters have had on organisations in APAC over the past few years, and particularly the impact on their IT operations. We surveyed 200 or so IT managers across the region, particularly focused on the markets of Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong and Singapore. And what we found interestingly was that about a quarter of IT managers, 27% in fact, reported that their regional IT infrastructure had been impacted by a natural disaster in the past 2 years. And that percentage was highest amongst New Zealand-based IT managers, perhaps not surprising given the very significant earthquake in Christchurch, followed by IT managers in Singapore, Hong Kong, who have experienced impact on their regional operations, particularly those who had operations in the Philippines, Japan, China and Australia. So typically somewhere between a quarter and a third of organisations in the countries we surveyed have had an impact of a natural disaster on their IT infrastructure in the past 2 years. And those disasters have a number of forms. Of those that reported that their organisation had been affected by a natural disaster, for over half it was either a flood or an earthquake, or in many cases both, particularly for those with operations in Japan, New Zealand, Thailand and Australia. Fire is normally a more localised disaster, but even there over 20% of organisations had been impacted over the past 2 years by a fire. And what's the impact of the natural disasters on a business? What's significant, we found that in most cases the impact of this event was very significant on IT infrastructure. 70% of IT managers report that the effect was somewhat or very critical, particularly for organisations based in Hong Kong and Singapore. So it's clear to us that these natural disasters are having quite a significant effect on business operations and particularly the IT infrastructure of many organisations across the region. We also asked organisations how vulnerable they felt they were to any event that destroyed their IT infrastructure at their head office. And almost 90% of organisations that we talked to believe that they are vulnerable, 20% thinking they're extremely vulnerable. So overall, there appears to be quite significant risk to a vast majority of organisations for any event that takes out the IT infrastructure in their head office. And we think this vulnerability is especially high for what you might call real-time businesses that are reliant on real-time interaction with customers or suppliers, organisations like banks, trading companies, even online retailers. And this has raised the bar, I think, in terms of the degree of technology that's required and the degree of planning that's required for these kind of businesses to address and to cope with natural disasters. Even a minimum disruption can have a catastrophic impact on the viability of their business. So broadly speaking, there are 4 ways that an organisation can approach protecting themselves against some kind of disruption. We've called these avoid, accept, transfer or mitigate. The first avoid is an organisation may take steps to ensure an incident doesn't occur. It's feasible perhaps for man-made disruptions such as sabotage or error or perhaps even cyber attacks, but not really feasible for any kind of natural event like a fire, a flood or anything else that's simply impossible to avoid. If the perceived impact of any event is seen as acceptable, an organisation may actually choose to do nothing, particularly if the costs of being prepared are seen to outweigh the consequences of any disruption in financial terms. But it's rarely actually a conscious response in today's data and IT intensive world. For many organisations, though, this is actually still a subconscious response. In other words, organisations are tacitly adopting an accept policy without consciously doing so. Transferring the risk to a third party, perhaps via outsourcing all data storage and application hosting, is another option. That could be done, for example, to a specialist provider who's developed the infrastructure and resources necessary to cope with these kind of disruptions. And finally, mitigation, introducing business processes, infrastructure, such as multiple redundancy, off-site hosting, etc., such that the impact of any event on a business is mitigated. So these are the 4 broad ways that organisations can protect themselves against a particular incident or a particular risk. And it brings us on to the themes of business continuity and disaster recovery. And I'll talk a bit about both at a sort of a fairly generic level. So let's start with business continuity. So business continuity asks, what's the likelihood of an event happening? What aspects of my business will it affect? And what's my overall business strategy to deal with this until life gets back to normal? Business continuity really involves preparing and at times implementing a plan that can be implemented when needed, including planning for and preventing business interruptions, and more importantly, the ability to continue your critical business functions both during and immediately after any kind of incident that might disrupt your business from a disaster or anything else. A business continuity plan needs to be quite holistic. It needs to cover areas such as people, workflows, facilities, communications and information infrastructure. So a broad range of aspects of the business need to be covered by the business continuity plan. Every organisation really needs to have one. I suspect that many probably don't. Disaster recovery is really a bit separate to a business continuity. It's the process whereby an organisation can resume operations as fully and as quickly as possible following any kind of unexpected event which impacts its business. Disaster recovery asks questions like, who are the critical people needed to keep an organisation running? What are my backup resources and are they ready to deploy? What are the kind of outlined procedures I need to take during a particular crisis? And we're finding actually an increasingly common aspect of disaster recovery is the use of specialised disaster recovery centres, or DRCs, which provide the infrastructure to allow a business to function after any kind of event which stops it from functioning in its normal premises. For example, enabling it to continue to access data and applications, providing working facilities, other infrastructure, phones and these kind of things and so on. And we're finding that these kind of DR plans are increasingly built, what you might say, in the cloud, as the off-premise hosting and multiple redundancies that the cloud offers generally form an essential part of any disaster recovery plan. A cloud-based disaster recovery plan effectively virtually replicates a company's computing infrastructure, but in the cloud, enabling you to continue to access your applications and your data basically from any internet-enabled location. So as I mentioned, there is growing interest in the use of DRCs, with many commercial organizations now offering these kind of facilities. And typically DRCs are built around data centers that have the highest levels of security and redundancy, but can go beyond the provision of servers to offer other facilities and infrastructure such as work areas, telephony and so on. But core to DRCs really is still the hosting of data and applications, allowing an organization to resume normal operations as soon as possible after an event. And these kind of centers can help an organization to sustain productivity by providing an alternate work environment, improve business continuity by helping an organization's risk tolerance and flexibility, enhancing business value by enabling you to maintain critical operations and therefore maintaining customer satisfaction, delivering the kind of technology, infrastructure and environmental services that employees require to operate during a recovery process, demonstrate preparedness and corporate responsibility, and perhaps also to achieve compliance so that you can develop a comprehensive continuity plan to demonstrate to any kind of regulatory body that might be regulating your industry or your business that you are in compliance with that particular organization's requirements. And typically we're finding that most organizations would choose to outsource a significant component of their disaster recovery or business continuity processes, because trying to do this in-house, particularly for disaster recovery, is really quite risky in many cases, and consequently use of outsourced providers is increasingly common. Our research shows that about 50% of large Australian organisations are now outsourcing their data centres, and although it's lower for specialist DR facilities, many organisations still don't have access to those on an outsourced basis. There is growing interest also in this type of outsourced facility. And the use of a specialist data third-party provider offers a number of benefits in terms of factors such as specialist providers have the processes, resources and infrastructure to specialise in disaster recovery, which few companies can have in-house. Organisations will generally lack these kind of in-house facilities and certainly lack the kind of infrastructure that third parties can provide. Using a third party allows you to make an unbiased decision. There's no special focus if an event occurs on particular departments or units, but rather a whole of organisation disaster recovery can be adopted. Due to their scale, third parties who serve multiple clients can provide facilities at a lower cost than can be done in-house. And finally, it allows any organisation to focus on your core competences, your core business, rather than trying to manage a disaster recovery process which may be well outside your normal competence or your normal area of expertise. And in terms of a disaster recovery plan itself, we think there are 5 critical steps or components that are needed, particularly for an ICT-related disaster recovery plan. We call these inspection, protection, detection, response, and reflection. In inspection, what we mean is you need to identify the key corporate functions of your organisation, the information resources they need, when and how they need them. And that leads you to develop a resource inventory and a risk threat and a potential loss assessment. So you're looking at what kind of applications and what kind of data different parts of your business need to be able to continue to function, particularly those that are really critical for ongoing generation of revenue, customer-facing units particularly. What kind of applications do they need access to? What kind of data do they need access to? And what is the risk of loss of that data or application? Protection involves proactive risk reduction for any of these processes to try to prevent business interruption. So what can you protect? What level of protection do you require, and how can you implement it? Detection really involves any process that minimizes the loss of an incident. So you're looking to detect an incident happening very quickly so that you can take adaptive steps to respond as quickly as possible. And that response really is around how you go about responding to an incident. When do you invoke a disaster recovery plan? When do you start to move people? When do you start to access alternative resources? And the fifth element is reflection. So after any plan, as we say, no plan ever survives contact with the enemy. Look back and see what went right, what went wrong, what do we need to do better next time, and adjust your plan accordingly. So I'd like to end really by offering 10 what I've called best practice tips on disaster recovery. The first is really about expect the unexpected. Imagine worst case scenarios when planning for disasters. Who would have thought, for example, 5 years ago that the whole of Christchurch could be destroyed in an earthquake, New Zealand's second biggest city? Imagine that happening in Melbourne, Australia's second biggest city, the entire CBD being taken out for 5 years. It's just an event that most of us can't imagine, but it can happen. And that's the kind of event that you really need to incorporate in your disaster recovery plan, because you can be certain that the unexpected will happen. The plan needs to be organisational wide, so plan for recovery that addresses everything from computers to customer service, phone banks to paper-based assets. Every critical function that you need to keep your business going, to continue to generate revenue, to continue to keep your staff productive, must be addressed. Failing to check the plan actually is a common shortcoming, and the only way you can really gauge effectiveness and troubleshoot weak spots is to regularly test the plan. I think another important element is firstly focus on your staff, because let's not forget that any issue that affects your business, particularly a natural disaster related issue, is often going to have many human elements to it. Although survival of your business is at stake, your employees may be facing their own unrelated personal tragedies or crises. And include programs in your plan to enable your employees to address any particular personal issues that they may have, whether it's medical care, personal financial assistance, stress relief, or whatever. Because unless your employees know that their families and personal property are safe, they're not going to be focused on helping to recover the business. I think management leadership is another important aspect of disaster recovery. Business continuity and disaster recovery often fails when senior management is not fully committed, seeing it perhaps as an almost irrelevant exercise that's entirely hypothetical. Not only should senior managers be seen to be out in front during the planning process, they also need to be highly visible during the recovery process. Communication is another critical aspect of disaster recovery. Every single employee with a role in the recovery should be updated on its progress. It's easy for rumours and misinformation to spread. These are bad for the business, and they can hamper the recovery process. So during any kind of recovery for an event, communication needs to be regular, it needs to be comprehensive, it needs to be thorough. I think the use of national vendors to support you, who can offer a national presence, is another important aspect, because some disasters that cause damage to a locality can also have impacted on local vendors. If your data center provider is next door and an event hits your building, there's a good chance actually it'll have impacted their building as well. So often you need to make sure that you've got national backup, vendors with facilities in unrelated, in distant locations that are highly unlikely to be impacted simultaneously by any event that affects you. Communication problems are something that need to be anticipated. Almost certainly natural disasters such as an earthquake or a hurricane, as well as perhaps impacting a building, could bring down power and phone lines. If you don't have access to cellular phones, you might not be able to communicate with key personnel. So assume communications will be affected, and make sure you've got alternative and backup ways of communicating with people. Prepare for any eventuality. So no matter how well prepared you are, there'll always be some unexpected challenges and expenses. For example, providing employees with access to food. You know, employees at a premises who perhaps used to go to a cafe that's no longer functional, or perhaps now a disaster recovery centre and don't know where to go for their lunch. These kind of things are things that you need to think about to make sure that your staff can continue to be productive during a recovery process. But finally, I think that business continuity and disaster recovery can actually be used to your advantage, particularly when it comes to getting in front of your customers and enhancing your reputation with customers. Your customers, I don't think, will blame you for experiencing a disaster or any kind of disruption, but they won't accept excuses when it comes to the speed of your recovery or the level of your customer service following the recovery. And a little bit proactive effort on your part in terms of recovery and proactive communication with customers can yield handsome returns in terms of customer confidence. So there are 10 best practice tips for disaster recovery. As I mentioned, we think that many organisations in Australia are not adequately prepared to address some of the disruptions that are occurring and are going to continue to occur. And this kind of disaster recovery approach, we think, is essential for any business in Australia to adopt. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark. That was great. There's certainly a lot to consider there in terms of planning for any type of event that might be disruptive to our business. Just thanks for everyone for contributing. There's a lot of questions there that we can certainly go through, and I'll endeavour now just to go through a couple of the key questions that we've seen come through over the period of the webinar. So one for Mark from Graham, first one being, how important is the location of your data centre when considering disaster recovery planning?
Look, I think it's very important. As I mentioned, probably one of the easiest things to do is to use a data center that's very close to your premises for latency reasons. You know, there's a view that perhaps if the data center is extremely close to my core business operations, then that means the latency issue is going to be minimized. But that obviously runs the risk of any event that impacts your premises is also going to impact the data center. And therefore, if you're using an outsourced data center vendor, using a data center vendor that has redundancy, at least 2 data centers with backup in each and redundancy between the both, I think is critical. So yeah, thinking carefully about where data is located and where data center is located is an absolutely fundamental part of any business continuity plan. I think it's perhaps one of the most fundamental aspects of it, in fact.
Thanks, Mark. That was great. A question for Agatar. Agatar, what do you think, in terms of the approaching summer season, would be the most damaging or impactful event that we should consider?
It would be heat waves. By far, obviously, individual bushfires can be tremendously damaging, but with regards to heat waves, some of the research that I have seen is that in terms of mortality, morbidity, impacts on services, power, they do far more damage than any of the hazards Australia experiences combined. So the combined hazards, really heat waves are by far the most impactful there. So a really critical season going into summer with those increased numbers of heat waves.
Yeah, look, I would agree. I think, you know, a couple of years ago, Melbourne experienced some of those heat waves where we had 10 days over 40, which really impacted on the ability to deliver power, particularly to the CBD. Thank you for that. One more from Helen, which is an interesting one for Mark. Is the DR and the business continuity strategy the responsibility of finance or IT?
Look, I think when this kind of strategy gets just allocated to a single department only, then you're in trouble. Any kind of business continuity plan has to be an organisational-wide plan, because every department that's involved in supporting an organisation to function has to be involved in the business continuity planning process, and also has to be involved in disaster recovery. So simply saying I'll get my IT department to do a plan or I'll get my finance department to do a plan is a bit of an opt-out, to be honest. It's got to be an organisational-wide approach driven from the top, involving every organisation in the business, so that every potential impact can be identified and every potential impact on the business can be planned for. It's got to be an organisational-wide approach.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. Look, we're coming to the end of time. We have one last poll. If everyone could contribute their thoughts to the poll that gets presented on your webpage right now, that would be great. So there's 4 responses to the question, just in terms of how you're feeling about your DR plan. And we can see there's quite a few responses coming in. And what's interesting to note that at the moment we don't have anyone that's extremely comfortable with the level of planning they have across their strategies for disaster recovery or business continuity. What's interesting to note as well that there is also quite a number that still need to further develop their plans for DR. Okay, so I might just draw the webinar to a conclusion, and once again would like to thank Agita Amalska from the Bureau of Meteorology for contributing the information, the forecasts coming with respect to Australia's summer season. Thank you, Agita, and also to Mark Dugan from Frost & Sullivan for contributing best practice and some of the research that Frost & Sullivan has been conducting in this area. It's fantastic. If you'd like to share with your colleagues this webinar, we'll shortly present it to you so you can have access to it, all of the information that's presented here. And certainly, if you wish to discuss at any point the maturity or how you'd like to improve the effectiveness of your disaster recovery strategy or indeed business continuity planning, we've left a phone number there to contact Nextgen. We certainly believe that we can help you in terms of adding value to make your DR and your BC planning far more effective. So thanks everyone for joining us. I really appreciate you getting in and working with us in terms of understanding some of the best practices around this important topic, and we look forward to bringing the next webinar to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Agata.